One of the most fascinating incidents of 20th century railroading took place on a small Midwestern carrier, the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railroad, during the 1920s. In 1920, automotive giant Henry Ford purchased the property. It was in a total state of disrepair and quite unlikely the candidate to be considered amongst the business holdings of Mr. Ford. He literally jerked the railroad into the eyes of the public and to the forefront of technology with his zest for experimentation. Ford did many things to and with the DT&I, some beneficial, some naive. His greatest success was to ensure the long-term financial future of the railroad through his negotiations through favorable rates with connecting railroads, and with the establishment of much of his Ford Motor Company traffic onto the railroad. His other major contributions were the establishment of the Detroit and Ironton Railroad, from Flat Rock, Michigan to the Rouge Complex, the construction of the Malinta Cutoff, and his short-lived railroad electrification program. Here are the films of Henry Ford's ownership and operation of the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railroad between the years of 1920 and 1929. In this opening scene at the south end of the DT&I at Ironton, Ohio, on the Ohio River, we see the yard engine switching a cut of cars on Railroad Street just 3 blocks from the Ohio River. It is moving south as the southbound passenger train number 6 returns from Jackson, about 45 miles to the north. Note the runabouts, largely of Henry Ford's manufacture, and the horse-drawn wagon as we approach the station. Ironton was founded in 1849 because of the rich iron ore deposits along the north side of the Ohio River, just north of the village. At its peak, the town had nearly 90 iron furnaces producing pig iron for many of the industries in the United States and globally, and it was also a source for much coal and fine foundry sand used throughout the entire country. The passenger train on this end of the railroad typically consisted of a coach, a combination baggage car RPO, and a baggage car. The DT&I was a mid-street operation right down the heart of Ironton on Railroad Street. From the train we can see the buildings as they approach the station at the end of 2nd and Railroad Street. In this 1921 Ford film, the DT&I station at 2nd Street is visible. In the background is the new Ironton-Russell Ohio River Bridge, which was opened in 1922. Its length was 2,400 feet. The passenger train you see stopping here was on the east leg of the Y, which also held the platform for which passengers could board and leave the train. DT&I passenger trains of this era were neither glamorous nor luxurious. They were utilitarian means of transporting people from one community to another along the line. The passenger station on the left also served as the freight house in Ironton. This station was built in 1909, replacing an older wood frame structure on the same site. It was a rather busy station along the Ohio River, serving both the needs of the community as well as the many foundries and other industries in the region at the time. After unloading the train at the station, it was back north to the north switch for the Y, and then it proceeded south along the west leg of the Y to eventually turn and back up to the roundhouse facility, which was east of the depot along the Ohio River. Locomotive number 83, a 460 built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1904, featured 63-inch drivers and 175 psi of steam pressure. It had recently been put through the Ford shops and given the Ford treatment for appearance purposes. This is the equipment that was often reported as being wiped by the engine crew every time the train stopped, and they did. Improvements included chromed raised letters and numbers, the new DT&I logo, the highly polished Russian iron, and the highly noted and touted polished appearance. In this day, all of the passenger equipment were wood-bodied cars. After the passenger train had cleared through the Y, one of the yard engines would bring up the local freight cars to be switched out on the 2 tracks of the freight house. As the yard engine moves across 2nd Street, note the early Ford products sitting on the side. In this day, many of these early cars were referred to as machines. Automobiles were still a seasonal item that were put away for bad weather and not gotten back out until springtime. A southbound train has arrived in Ironton. As it rolled down Railroad Street, the maximum allowed speed limit was 8 miles an hour. All freight trains took the West Y and then backed over to the yards, which were actually to the east or the left of the station. All trains then backed east, crossed the Norfolk and Western Railway, which ran parallel with the DT&I Railroad along the Ohio River, to access their roundhouse and yard facilities. Number 6, the northbound passenger train, is arriving at the platform on the east leg of the Y. The morning sun of Ironton glistens as anxious passengers arrive to begin boarding the train. Their trip will be by no means a speedy one, as it's 8 miles an hour until you get to the end of Railroad Street in Ironton, and then it goes to a paltry 12 miles an hour all the way up to Bloom Junction. The locomotive for this trip also happens to be DT&I number 83. The same passenger equipment will also make the run back north. For Henry Ford, the south end of the railroad was completely opposite of the very industrial north end of the railroad that the auto industry was using at this date. In a broader perspective, we're looking south on Railroad Street from the north end of Ironton as the Norfolk and Western train heads west towards Cincinnati. The movie crew has positioned themselves near the DT&I roundhouse at Ironton on the Ohio River. Passenger train number 6 has come in from the north and sits on one of the shop tracks awaiting servicing. The DT&I roundhouse and yards sat on the Ohio River and were subject to an occasional Ohio River flood. The brick roundhouse consisted of 8 stalls and was a leftover from the days of the Iron Railroad, which were the original tracks laid into Ironton. In this scene we can see one of 2 280 locomotives assigned to Ironton yard operations. They were kept busy with DT&I yard switching and Norfolk and Western Railway interchange. A wood-body coal gun of DT&I origins sits in the yard. Some original iron rails from the Iron Railroad were discovered elsewhere in the yard. In these views you can see an end view of a piece of rail cast and rolled about 1865. And note the jointing of the rails. There were no bolt nor fish plates. This is the south end of the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railroad. Looking west towards Ironton along the Ohio River and the parallel Norfolk and Western Railway, we can see the inclined plane used to load the car ferry that once plied across the river to the Russell, Kentucky side. The car ferry operation appears to have ended just before Henry Ford took over operation of the railroad. You can also see a crossed river to the Kentucky side in this scene and the C&O yard along the opposite shore. Henry Ford sent out a film crew to document his railroad from Ironton, Ohio all the way to Detroit, Michigan. They had their own train, including a flat car for photographic equipment, a caboose, a locomotive, and of course a tender. This was a contract crew and not employees of the Ford Motor Company. They started at Ironton, Ohio, and filmed most of the way until they got to Napoleon. The Melinta Cutoff hadn't been built yet, so there was no photographing of that, nor the future heavy electrification efforts between Flat Rock and Ford's Rouge Works. In the Hanging Rock Iron region north of Ironton, the film crew came upon an abandoned log cabin and the remains of a 19th century iron furnace. The furnace itself was of cut stone construction. The iron was excavated opposed to being mined in this region. It sat very close to the surface. Hardwood charcoal was first used as a fuel, and later coal and coke became the fuels in these furnaces. There were over 100 furnaces in the region between Ironton and Jackson, a distance of between 40 and 50 miles. The region had been played out by about the year 1900, with new seams being discovered elsewhere. Parting Ironton, the photographer's train passes through a stone cut just north of town on the way to Royersville Tunnel. The speed for trains between Royersville Tunnel and Ironton was 20 miles an hour for passenger trains and a very rapid 12 miles an hour for freight trains. Through Royersville Tunnel, all trains traveled at no more than 6 miles per hour. Northbound passenger train number 5 comes into view north of Ironton on its rapid journey to Jackson. In this region, the railroad was also a major highway for all of the hill residents. There were 2 scheduled freight trains daily over this track, numbers 98 and 99. The main source for northbound freight was the Summit Solvay coke ovens. Those trains generally consisted of 20 to 30 cars and were cut into 2 sections for the climb up through Royersville Tunnel and to negotiate the grades out of the Ohio River Valley. Many of the local residents had their cabins, homes, and even their mercantiles along the railroad because of its immediate location. Sidings and spurs on the south end included such colorful names as Ginn's Mine, Hanging Rock Mine, Haley's Farm, and Wagner's, just to name a few. Of those sidings mentioned, the largest held exactly 10 cars. Others held anywhere from 4 to 6 to 8 cars. So definitely the south end of the railroad was no large Class 1 main line. This section of the railroad was very much prone to heavy grades and sharp curves. A number of bridges on the south end of the railroad would not carry the load of a double-headed locomotives when coupled together. The Book of Rules required that 2 cars be placed between each locomotive when operating on the south end. As Ford and his team devised plans to improve the operation of the railroad, one of their considerations was to bypass the entire south end of the railroad from Jackson to the Ohio River completely and build an entirely new line, eliminating as many curves and other difficulties as possible, with the eventual eye towards electrification. The south end was a very expensive piece of railroad for anyone to maintain. Vesuvius Station was about 4 miles north of Ironton and just about 4/10 of a mile south of Royersville Tunnel. Royersville Tunnel was the only such tunnel on the DT&I Railroad. It was originally constructed about 1851 by the Iron Railroad to serve the many iron furnaces in this region. At 956 feet of length, it followed a mined coal seam through the side of the hill. Thus it was not shaped as we would imagine a normal tunnel would be. The floor of the tunnel was deepened in order to accommodate the laying of rails. In the early 1880s, the Toledo, Delphus, and Burlington Railroad, a narrow-gauge railroad of that day, achieved Ironton by laying a 3rd rail through the tunnel for a dual-gauge railroad. It was subject to frequent ceiling collapse, and when Ford purchased the railroad, tunnel speeds were limited to 6 miles per hour, a situation which never improved. The ceiling height was a maximum 16 feet, which precluded the passage of oversized cars. Tunnel watchmen and block operators were used for many years at both ends of the tunnel, but had been removed during the Henry Ford years of ownership. North of Royersville Tunnel were such colorful station names as Pedro, Lissman, Goldcamp, Superior, Crawford, Andre, and Hayward, arriving at Bloom Junction for the run over the B&O to Jackson. This was a 23-mile stretch of trackage rights over the B&O. DT&I passenger trains did have the privilege to stop at Oak Hill, about halfway between Jackson and Bloom Junction. The whole south end of the DT&I frustrated Henry Ford. He wanted to build an entirely new route. In this last scene, the train is exiting southbound from the tunnel and looks at the village of Vesuvius in the distance. After a 23-mile run over the B&O Railroad, the DT&I passenger train arrives in Jackson. This was the major shops town for the DT&I in the 1920s. Northbound passenger train number 5 is arriving at the station, which happened to be at the B&O Junction in Jackson. This town enjoyed the locomotive and freight car shops of the railroad, along with 3 major iron producers. This was heavy industry at its finest. Jackson was 327 miles south of Detroit and in the 4th District of the Southern Division of the DT&I. As soon as the passengers, express, mail, and other freight are taken from the passenger train, it'll be taken down to the roundhouse for servicing and resupplying. Of course, Ford didn't have any dining cars. He didn't have any need for them on this railroad. Henry Ford encouraged his railroad employees to buy the product that he made, which was automobile, and he liberally applied the automobiles to the railroad publicity photos of the day. Here are the DT&I shops at Jackson, built in the year of 1907. Henry Ford felt that the shops would be better used to maintain locomotives for the south end of the railroad and moved all heavy locomotive rebuilding and repair to his new Fordson locomotive shops built at the Rouge in Michigan. All freight car maintenance and program rebuilding was moved to Jackson. The facilities were retooled to handle maintenance on 2,800 pieces of rolling stock. The shops and roundhouse were all sited near Athens Street in Jackson. Part of the locomotive service facilities at Jackson included the ash pit for the dumping of cinders from the ash pans of all operating steam locomotives. Ford was a stickler for housekeeping on his railroad. DT&I employees found to have poor housekeeping habits were sent to work the ash pits for several weeks as punishment. They were given their normal pay and away-from-home housing while shoveling the cinder pits. Inside the back shop, a wood-bodied passenger coach is undergoing repair. Ford opted to maintain the wooden equipment opposed to the state-of-the-art steel technology used in passenger car construction. In this scene, DT&I locomotive number 77, a 280, is on the turntable at Jackson and ready for a turn and alignment into an inspection stall of the roundhouse. This was an Armstrong turntable, otherwise completely operated by hand. In the floor of the building is an inspection pit visible in the foreground, where men could get under the locomotive and inspect the various brake rigging, springs, axles, journals, and guides under the locomotive. Henry Ford wanted the grimy interior walls of this roundhouse whitewashed, and they were. He also insisted that his employees not smoke on railroad property. A watchman made sure no one smoked. If they did, they were terminated. At least one man swallowed a lighted cigarette so he could keep his job. In the back shop at Jackson, DT&I 280, number 113, is undergoing lifting and removal of the front driver set for further repairs. Lacking a drop pit for the easy removal of a single axle set, the typical method of lifting would have been to lift the entire locomotive via an overhead crane. But here again the shop was lacking that particular piece of equipment, and so they used floor-mounted screw lift jacks to lift the locomotive up above the driver's set. With the engine fully above the errant driver set to be repaired, it was wheeled out of the shop building and elsewhere so that specific maintenance could be completed. Once repairs were completed, the driver set with the 2 attached rods were brought back into the shop, and the locomotive slowly lowered back until it was on the wheels again. Drive rods, specific brake rigging, and potential lubrication lines were reattached before the locomotive was moved out of the shop building. Once outside, the locomotive tender would have been reattached. Ford emphasized employee safety during this period of time and would not tolerate poor practices from employees who only wanted to do half the job. Every railroad shop had a power plant in order to supply electricity and steam for the various buildings in operation. The DT&I at Jackson, Ohio was no different. This is one of the coreless steam engines which powered the main generators, of which there were 2 in this building, to supply electricity throughout the complex. Next to the coreless engine is a small vertical steam engine with an exciter generator on there to feed electric to the coils of the main generator. Painting to the right is a main generator and the framework for another coreless engine. There was a municipal light plant in town, however it was too small to meet the needs of the railroad. This is the rod finishing department at the Jackson shops. they rebushed and polished all of the rods before reapplying them to the locomotive. Note the locomotive in the right background. Two shop employees roll wheels from the wheel storage yard along Athens Street into the press shop so that they can be applied to the axle. The axle set, consisting of two wheels and an axle, were pressed together inside the shop. The wheels are cast steel, and any old wheels that were worn were shipped back up to the Rouge and put through the furnaces of the steel mill of the Ford Motor Company. New wheels were pressed onto the axles under several hundred tons of pressure, and we can see a wheel set coming off of the wheel axle press in this scene. Out in the yard, we find a carman applying a stencil to a newly painted boxcar and applying a coat of paint to reveal the DT&I logo. As the camera pans the shop facilities, note the logos on many of the buildings. Panning the complex from left to right, the rip tracks with all of the freight cars undergoing repair are in the foreground left. The shop buildings for all heavy and program repairs sits behind the rip tracks, and as we move to the right we can see the roundhouse and the water tank. The story is told of the railroad hiring a new machinist just after Henry Ford took over. At his first day on the job, he walked down the tracks and thought he'd pull his pipe out for a smoke. No more had he lighted his pipe, and he was tapped on the shoulder by one of the watchmen, advising him that smoking was not permitted on the property. He put his pipe away, went in and did his task at the machine shop, then went into the cab of the locomotive to apply the part that had been in question. He was standing on the engineer's seat when suddenly there's a tug at his pant leg, and he's politely told that there are step ladders to be used when happening to reach high places in the locomotive cab. Having gotten the step ladder and finished the work in the locomotive cab, he didn't see any more machine work to do, so he went over and sat down, to which the foreman came out and advised him that he was to get a can of whitewash and a paintbrush and proceed to start whitewashing the walls of the roundhouse. At the end of the week, he gave up in frustration, quit the railroad, and went back to the Big Four shops at Bellefontaine, Ohio. The shop complex did include a transfer table. In this scene, we can see the offices and the stores department, and in the closing scene of the shops, we can see the buildings from the Athens Street side. Note the pit track is covered with water and ice, a real problem if they wanted to unload a car at ground level. Locomotive servicing at Jackson included filling the tender or tank with water. Here we either see one of the engine hostlers from the roundhouse or the fireman of the locomotive as he stands atop the tender tank and pulls down the water spout to begin filling the tank. This particular water tank held 47,000 gallons of water. While it was a wooden tank, Ford had many of the tanks along the railroad rebuilt as all steel tanks. With water complete, the locomotive moves on over to the coal dock for a shot of black diamonds. This wooden building held several hundred tons of coal up in the air that would be gravity-fed into the coal bunker of the locomotive tender. With the tender filled, the chute would be raised, and the fireman would climb down into the locomotive cab to attend the boiler. Number 5, the northbound passenger train, arrives at Jackson from Ironton. Under Ford, the train crew was expected to not only handle the care and needs of the passengers, but as they made each station stop, the crew was expected to do general housekeeping to not only the train but the station grounds. This included washing the coach windows, as well as weeding the flower beds around the station. They were also known to maintain tracks, that is, to drive spikes, pull weed, and tighten joint bar bolts. Just another day on Henry Ford's DT&I. One of the DT&I's largest customers on the south end were the Silvery pig iron producers. At Jackson, there were two, Globe Iron Works and the Jackson Iron and Steel Company, also known as JISCO. Between the two plants, they jointly produced several 100,000 tons of pig iron every year. Almost all of the resources necessary to produce the pig iron was literally at their doorstep, including iron ore, coal, limestone, and sand. By the time JISCO started in 1906, the iron fields were starting to play out. Thus they went up to the upper peninsula of Michigan and northeastern Wisconsin to obtain iron ore. This resulted in much traffic for the DT&I, inbound iron ore and outbound pig iron, not to mention inbound coal, sand, and limestone. The Wellston District ran from the yards at Jackson to the village of Cornelia, 18.4 miles. Stations here included Chapman's, Colton, Glenroy, Wellston, Rathford, Lincoln, and Cornelia. While a branch line, this section of the railroad was laced with many coal mines and saw commuter trains to move miners daily between Wellston and the various mines. In the immediate area, the DT&I served 19 separate mines. Rail competition in the Wellston area was extreme. Besides the DT&I, the B&O Railroad, the Cincinnati-Hamilton-Dayton Railroad, and the Wellston and Jackson Belt Railway also served many of the mines. The Wellston and Jackson Belt Railway also ran parallel with the DT&I between Jackson and Wellston. Wellston was also a heavy manufacturing center. It featured Milton Furnace and the Wellston Foundry and Machine Works, both producing pig iron. The coal in this region was considered very high quality and excellent for smelting and coking. Ford even purchased some coal out of this area for his Michigan manufacturing operations. Looking around Wellston, we see the post office, the main street, as well as the courthouse. These were all important to the people of this region. Track speeds were limited to 10 miles an hour for all trains on the Wellston District. It was a vital artery to the success of the DT&I. After World War I, many of the coal mines in the Wellston district were starting to close. We see here views of one of the two remaining active coal mines in the early years of the Ford ownership of the DT&I. Locomotive number 79, a 280 built by the Rhode Island Locomotive Works in 1902, has been remodeled with many of the Ford features for this particular era. The train's ground crew uses hand signals to motion the engineer for the next move. Most of the cars of this era held between 40 and 60 tons of coal. A large coal hopper consisted of twin hopper outlets. These particular hopper cars belonged to the Ford Motor Company. Ford also owned a number of coal mines in Kentucky, and that coal was brought up on the Norfolk and Western Railway and interchanged with the DT&I at Glen Jean, Ohio, on the east side of Waverly. Unit trains of Ford coal was a common sight on the DT&I. It was all destined for the Rouge Mill and the coke ovens. Some coal went to Toledo and was put on one of the Ford coal boats and taken into the Rouge for processing. A doubleheader has commenced to move a coal train north from Jackson towards Waverly. The lead locomotive is one of the 100 series 280s, and the second engine is a 210 originally built for the Russian government but diverted because of the start of World War I. Neither of the engines had undergone the Ford modernization process. Train speeds north of Jackson were 40 miles an hour on all tangent track, 25 miles an hour on all curves, and over Summit Hill 12 miles an hour. On the Southern Division, 3rd District, a northbound coal train pulled by one of the 210s approaches the camera. The 210s were built in March of 1918 and weighed in at 185,000 pounds. While having the largest number of drive wheels, they were not the heaviest engines on the railroad. That privilege went to locomotives number 200 and 201, which weighed in at 248,000 pounds on 8 drive wheels. As the train passes by, note the brakeman riding on top of the open-top hopper cars, and they are Ford Motor Company hopper cars full of coal. After Ford took over operation of the railroad, he insisted that railroad crews not cook in the caboose. Company-approved restaurants and lodging were set up at various terminal towns to accommodate all away-from-home train crews. Ford wanted to ensure that every employee was surrounded by a wholesome environment and they maintained neatness and orderliness. He also wanted to avoid waste and instill safety in every operation on the railroad. Looking from the back side of the caboose, one can see several bridges that we passed through on the way towards Glen Jean. Bridge restrictions and bridge clearances were a constant problem for the railroad. Overhead clearances were as low as 15 feet 10 inches at some points. Note that the telegraph poles only carried 2 or 3 pairs of wires along the distance of the railroad. Some mainline railroads had as many as 50 or 60 pair of telegraph lines. The railroad was largely operated by train orders. This is the Scioto River Bridge east of Waverly. It was the longest bridge on the DT&I and also one of the weaker bridges. Freight trains were limited to 6 miles an hour, and passenger trains were limited to 10 miles an hour while passing over the approaches or the bridge proper. Under Ford ownership, when either of the 200 class locomotives were double-headed, either together or with another class of engine, there was to be 2 freight cars between each engine at all times when passing over the bridge. Just west of the Scioto River Bridge was the Glen Jean crossing of the Norfolk and Western Railway. A lot of Ford Company coal was picked up at this interchange for movement on up to the Rouge. The photographers followed this coal train from the interchange all the way up to Summit Station. The 2 locomotives assigned as a doubleheader this day included 210 number 303 and the heavy 280 number 200. Neither had been put through the Fordson shops for rebuilding at this time. The photographers had a gondola placed in front of the lead engine, the 210, and they filmed much of the train all the way to Summit, either looking forward as they advanced up the hill or backwards at the train. By the time the train reached Denver, the doubleheader had been cut, with the 280 becoming a pusher on the rear of the train, and the train itself had left half of its tonnage on the siding at Denver. At times, the exhaust from the pusher engine can be seen in the distance. Departing Glen Jean, the train passes over a steel bridge and shortly passes the Waverly Station. Here the battle begins for the climb up to Summit. It was a torturous and dangerous 12-mile climb. Maximum allowed train speed for all trains was just 12 miles an hour, and many times it was a lot less than that. The operation of trains over Summit Hill was a tremendous operating problem for the railroad, and Henry Ford proposed completely bypassing Summit Hill and building a direct line from Bainbridge on the north side of the hill direct to Portsmouth to connect with the Norfolk and Western Railway there. The new route was never built. Henry Ford was having difficulties with the Interstate Commerce Commission. Between Waverly and Summit Station, on the south side of Summit Hill, the tracks rose nearly 400 feet in the 12-mile run. In the 4 miles between Denver and Summit, the tracks rose almost 300 feet. The origins of this right-of-way and these steep grades go back to the construction of the narrow-gauge Springfield, Jackson, and Pomeroy Railroad and the free use of land offered by a timber owner in the region. In this scene, the train is slowing and will stop in order to cut part of its train and reduce tonnage for the final miles to Summit. Note the brakeman on top of the cars as the train eases backwards. Ford thought this kind of activity was not productive for the railroad. With approximately 20 loaded hopper cars behind the 210, the train fights for every inch of rail on the march up to Summit Hill. The hilltops that you can see in the background were not known as mountaintops, but rather knobs. Northbound freight trains were generally cut into 2 or 3 sections, and each section taken up to a staging track at Summit Station. All trains were held for 15 minutes at Summit Station, usually to allow the brakeman to set the retainers for the trip down the hill. A train crew could spend an entire 16-hour shift operating just between Waverly and Summit Station. Hence Ford's idea to completely bypass Summit with a much lower water level route. Going back to Glen Jean, we can see the Norfolk and Western connection and crossing with the DT&I. The photographer's train has just left the approaches to the Scioto River Bridge and is nearing the N&W crossing at Glen Jean Tower. The N&W and DT&I interchange yard is visible. On the ridge above the valley, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad will establish its main line between Sciotaville on the Ohio River, Lineville Junction, and Columbus in the year 1927. This gave Ford a second major interchange for coal coming from his coal mines and established Greg's as an interchange point. The tower at Glen Jean was a full interlocking plant protecting the DT&I and the Norfolk and Western Railway crossing. This remained a strong point of interchange for Henry Ford and the DT&I Railroad. The photographer's train passes a standing freight at the transfer yard at Glen Jean. This DT&I caboose was built from a boxcar by the Ohio Southern Railroad about 1892. Henry Ford had all of these cabooses replaced in 1925 with brand new ones. Arriving at Waverly at 11:42 a.m., northbound passenger train number 5 stops to refresh its tender with water. Waverly was the southern base of Summit Hill. There were 4 scheduled trains daily at Waverly. They included passenger trains number 5 and 6 daily except Sunday, and freight trains 98 and 99 called the fast freights. There were also a number of extra trains that were unscheduled. Number 5 arrives at the Waverly station on its daily schedule. Send-off siding is on the right of the main line. It was used to derail trains out of control coming down from Summit Hill southbound. The station at Denver was inside the Mercantile, which also served as the post office. Grades on the south side of Summit Hill averaged about 1% and lacked many of the horseshoe curves present on the north side. Track maintenance was manual labor during the Henry Ford ownership. He did insist that all hand tools be of the top quality and in good condition at all times for the track workers. In the background are visible knolls from the surrounding hills as the photographer's train approaches Summit Station. All trains were held here 15 minutes to set up retainers or to let wheels cool from the brake. Visible on the left is Summit Station. Helper engines could take on coal and water and be turned at the Y. A small village surrounded the station. Passing Summit Station northbound, the photographer's train now starts its descent down the spectacular north side descending Summit Hill. The 3 main products shipped from Summit Station included lumber, blackberries in the summer, and fall chestnuts. Stone Cut was just west of Summit Station. All the curves on this side of Summit had names. The curves in this region ranged anywhere from 8 degrees all the way up to 20 degrees, with a large number being 15, 16, and 18 degrees. Further down the hill we come upon White Oak Curve. It was a 15-degree curve. Point Lookout Curve was a mild 13 degrees, and Uncle Tom's Curve was a very tight 20 degrees. It was the tightest curve on the entire railroad. Somewhere near Point Lookout Curve we see some homes in the foreground, and if you look above the homes you'll see the roadbed of the descending DT&I tracks as they drop down the grade. This was an isolated section of the railroad, and because of the number of curves in the grades it required constant attention. The curves generally had names. Some included Parrott's Curve, Toolhouse Curve, Horseshoe Curve, Bundy Point Curve, Uncle Tom's Curve, and all proved to be a bane for Henry Ford, but he was never able to bypass Summit Hill. Heavy railhead wear is visible as shown by a track inspector, who's also indicating the heavy metal shavings laying around the base of the rail, a constant problem on Summit Hill. At Minahan Bend, we find a southbound train headed upgrade towards Summit Hill. This was one of 4 horseshoe curves on the north side of the Summit Hill. All 4 horseshoe curves had a radius of between 15 and 18 degrees. Later in the day, a northbound train descends Summit Hill, and it too enters Minahan Bend. The retainers of all descending trains were set at Summit Hill so they could pass safely through all 4 horseshoe curves and the other grades and curves on the north side of Summit Hill. Descending down the hill, the train passes Stone Cut, Big Harris Curve, White Oak Curve, Point Lookout Curve, Uncle Tom's Curve, Minahan Bend, Sugar Point, and Horseshoe Curve before arriving at the village of Spargersville at the base of the fabled Summit Hill on Henry Ford's DT&I. At the base of Summit Hill was a small village of Spargersville and Cooper Brothers General Store and Mercantile. It also served as a station for the DT&I. As the train moves north, we can see the bridge and building gang making general repairs to the track and several pile trestles between Spargersville and Storms. Henry Ford thought it was important that trains run on time, and he made every effort to see to it that the roadbed and the track structure was in the best physical condition possible. The railroad's pile driver is passed as it moves from a passing siding to proceed down to the pile trestle for further repairs. Passing some camp cars for the B&B gang at Storms, it is noted that Henry Ford had a very specific dietary menu for his employees and a standard of housekeeping which he expected kept for those crews that were remote on the railroad. Stacks of new ties lay along the roadbed as we near Bainbridge. Note the covered bridge on the right. Bainbridge was 99 miles north of Ironton, and at one point had been a terminal between Springfield and Jackson on the former Ohio Southern Railroad. Mainline speed limits were 40 miles an hour for passenger trains and 25 miles an hour for freight trains on tangent track, and 25 miles an hour for passenger trains. The station and grounds were well kept. This was a requirement under Henry Ford's ownership. At the Bainbridge coal dock, a passenger train stops for a mid-division refueling. In addition to the station grounds, the site also included a coal tipple, sand house, turntable, and water tank for all locomotives. Helper engines were routinely turned here after they had come down from the north side of Summit Hill. Henry Ford had originally planned to build an entirely new route of railroad around Summit Hill down to Portsmouth, Ohio and the Norfolk and Western Railway, but the Interstate Commerce Commission blocked his plans in 1924. Leaving the Appalachian highlands of southern Ohio, the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railroad comes upon the plains of western Ohio. From Bainbridge to junction at Springfield was a distance of 57 miles, and the operating conditions were considerably different than the south. Under the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Bridge on its main line between Parkersburg, West Virginia, and Cincinnati, Ohio. The DT&I passenger station is 7/10 of a mile north of this underpass. The photographer's camera pans an iron bridge over Paint Creek. It was in this area of the railroad that Henry Ford discovered a high iron slag ballast from iron smelters along his railroad was being used on the track. Ford had the ballast dug up and sent to the Rouge for iron recovery and limestone dumped back along the track to replace the removed ballast. Parting the station, an old mill is visible that once served the Springfield, Jackson, and Pomeroy Railroad along the right of the screen. A southbound train awaits passage of the photographer's train someplace just north of Greenfield. North of Greenfield, we come upon the little station of Good Hope. It was at milepost 261.6. The station was typical of most along the DT&I tracks. It consisted of a baggage room where freight and baggage were gathered, the agent's bay in the middle, and a passenger waiting room on the far side. Near Boyd's water tank is visible in the distance. Entering Washington Courthouse, the railroad crossed Paint Creek for one last time, crossed the tracks of the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railroad, and the tracks of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Coming into view on the left is the DT&I Freight House. A yard engine sits on the siding ready to follow the photographer's train north. The train approaches the joint B&O CH&D passenger station. This is the B&O Midland sub from Cincinnati to Columbus. Departing from Washington Courthouse, the train passes a sawmill. At Jeffersonville, the Kingman branch departed west. Henry Ford occasionally pumped a handcar along the Kingman branch. That is Henry Ford's Lincoln pulling up beside the station. The photographer's train passes through the tiny village of South Solon and encounters a freight train that has taken the passing siding at South Charleston. Quickly passing the freight train, we come upon the crossing with the Pennsylvania Railroad at South Charleston. The interlocking tower is on the immediate left, and a white fence marks the stock pens. A westbound Pennsylvania Railroad passenger train quickly slips by. The north leg of the Y sits next to the stock pens, and the DT&I station sits next to the Y. At the southeast corner of Springfield, a northbound Ford Motor Company coal train comes into view. It is pulled by locomotive number 312, a 210. The photographer is at Junction Switch, the site of the first rail lane for the Springfield, Jackson, and Pomeroy Railroad, a narrow gauge. The Ford coal train is quite impressive as it moves by the photographer's camera. The caboose was originally an Ohio Southern Railroad boxcar. It was scrapped within a few years. Ford wanted to bypass Springfield community completely by boring a tunnel through limestone under the town. His plans were never carried forward. The original route around the city of Springfield following Buck Creek was maintained. Junction Switch led into downtown Springfield, the East Street Yards, roundhouse, turntable, and engine service facilities. All engines were serviced with coal and water here at Springfield. East Yard and the DT&I's connection into downtown Springfield were on a branch west of the actual main line and served through Junction Switch. It was in the heart of the industrial section of Springfield and provided much originating and terminating traffic for the DT&I. In this scene, a work train with a gondola, a work derrick, a locomotive, and a caboose heads east down the yard. Near the East Street Roundhouse, we see a pair of locomotives coming down the service tracks towards the coal tipple. This was the third and final roundhouse to sit on the East Street site. Although Henry Ford considered these facilities to be very inefficient, his focus was on attempting to move everything to South Charleston and work his railroad facilities and terminal area from that location. It was 9.2 rail miles south of Springfield. At the East Street Roundhouse, we can see the big hook in the right background as an engine backs out onto the turntable. All engines were serviced here, so no matter what direction they were going, all trains backed into Burt Street Yard or pulled into Burt Street Yard for servicing a crew change before continuing their journey either north or south. During 1922, Henry Ford introduced wireless telegraph, also known as radio communications, along the railroad. DT&I engineers experimented with radio receivers in locomotives. Antennae were installed on the water decks of some locomotive tenders, but the success was not good. A train telegraph operator had to be on the train because everything was sent in Morse code. The Burt Street Freight House was on the south side of the downtown Springfield Business District, directly across from the New York Central Station. Division offices were held in the same building. Passenger trains departed from the North Limestone Street Passenger Station, as we can see in the final scenes. This is the fill from the original Mosquito Lake Trostel just north of St. Paris, Ohio. By the time Henry Ford purchased the railroad, all of the wooden bents had been replaced by a dirt fill. It was over 1,700 feet in length. Ford had an entirely new water service facility built at St. Paris for the locomotive water needs. This included wells, a pump house, softener, and steel water tank, along with hydrants. He also had the station rotated 180 degrees and put on the opposite side of the railroad track to face the town. As the train passes through Quincy to the north, the station is visible in the far distance on the left of the track. Morgan Tower sits on the left of the diamonds which cross the Big Four. Just north of town was the 1,200-foot-long High Bridge. It was the highest bridge on the railroad. Henry Ford's private train derailed between High Bridge and Quincy, which was just to the south. Even though his car, Fairlane, was in a skewed position, it was upright, and when some children came down to see the famous industrialist, he invited them into the car for some treats and drinks. The bridge was quite spectacular, and many early excursions stopped there so visitors could picnic along the banks of the river. It was one of only 4 railroad bridges between Quincy and Dayton to survive the Great Flood of March 1913. When Ford took over ownership of the railroad, the speed over High Bridge was just 8 miles an hour. He later was able to raise it to 40 miles an hour by reinforcing the steel structure. The railroad passed through the farming communities of Maplewood, Jackson Center, Slater, St. John's, Uniopolis, before crossing the Erie Railroad and entering the yards at milepost 153 at Lima. Northbound passenger train number 1 pulls into the station at Lima on Bellefontaine Avenue. The station was undergoing significant addition and modifications to accommodate both freight and passenger service on the DT&I at Lima. There was a second and separate passenger station in Lima, achieved through a Y-track at Sugar Street crossing with the Pennsylvania Railroad. It was closed as soon as the Bellefontaine Avenue station was remodeled. Tracks of the Lima Street Railway Company are visible in the middle of Bellefontaine Avenue. All DT&I trains were required to stop at this street crossing and to be flagged through the crossing. Looking south, the coal tipple is visible on the left, along with camp cars and the small engine house. The rip tracks and various equipment needed to repair cars in place are visible as the cameraman pans around the lot. The DT&I crossed the Nickel Plate Road at Morris about 1.6 miles further north. Two DT&I passenger trains meet at an undisclosed location along the main line. Ford had reliable 460 locomotives assigned to all the passenger trains along the railroad, but he did not include any upgrades to the passenger car fleet, and they remained wooden-body coaches. The train crew were neatly dressed at all times. The Malenta cutoff had not been built yet when these films were made. A division point was Napoleon, Ohio. It was 50 miles north of Lima and 118 miles north of Springfield. At the freight house, boxcars are loaded with the manufactured goods. Ford sought every bit of business that he could possibly gain in every town along the railroad. Just up the track from the freight house was the passenger station. It was on Oakwood Avenue. Ford managers used it as an example of how they wanted all railroad stations to look. It included grass, gardens with flowers, and evergreens. The station was neatly kept at all times. A northbound DT&I coal train pulled by one of the 300 series 210Os enters the yard lead. Smoke rising from the fifth car behind the locomotive appears to be coming from stuck brake shoes overheating the wheels. A coal train running from Glen Jean to Napoleon took nearly a day and a half to make the 200-mile run because of service stops and Summit Hill. The caboose is another of the Ohio Southern Railroad 1892 conversions. Note the track worker on the ground seemingly cleaning debris from near the tracks. Ford demanded 8 hours work for 8 hours pay. He thought it only fair. When men needed to be shifted from, say, transportation crews, ground crews, or car repair crews, they were simply moved into those departments and used accordingly. He did not want to see men left idle or unemployed on his railroad. And by the same token, he also dismissed the unions from the railroad, instead increasing the pay to equal of that of a skilled tradesman. Ford also encouraged his employees to purchase Tin Lizzies, his famous Model Ts. Looking out over the yards, a variety of railroad cars is visible. A heavily loaded coal train makes its way north of Napoleon towards the Rouge and the coking ovens. Freight train speeds were limited to 15 miles an hour north of Napoleon, with the exception of South Yard to Durban, speed of 25 miles an hour for freight trains and 45 miles an hour for passenger trains. The railroad also imposed a maximum speed of 8 miles an hour when entering or leaving sidings and through crossovers over the entire railroad. All of these freight trains were handled by the 300 series 210 Russians and the 100 series 280 consolidations. As the locomotives came due for major shopping, they were taken to the Fordson shops at the Rouge, completely rebuilt, and as they said at the time, Fordized with the nickel-plated components and Russian iron jackets. The Ford remodeled engines were a real sight to see, and many people came trackside to see them. The coal train is being led by locomotive number 118. Note that the main line is not the sleek high-speed main line that you would typically see. Before Henry Ford divested himself of the railroad in 1929, he had much of the track and the roadbed upgraded to handle much higher speeds, longer and heavier trains. Ford answered the problem with construction of the Melinta Cutoff, which began in August of 1925. But it was not completed yet at the time Henry Ford sold the line on June 27, 1929. The Melinta Cutoff opened in October, and to honor Henry Ford's efforts, he was asked to sit at the throttle of the first train over the new cutoff. Looking out the cupola of a caboose, we see the northbound coal train from what the conductors saw. Visible in the cars are varying grades of coal, that is, coal of different sizes. It's obviously a cold wintry day. This is DT&I inspection car number 2, a 1922 Ford Model T. This double-headed passenger train is being led by the two 442 locomotives Henry Ford purchased from the Michigan Central Railroad to pull his own private train. Number 45 survives today at the Henry Ford Museum. Henry Ford's executive train, pulled by DT&I 460 number 80, a Wabash combination baggage and coach, and the private car Fairlane. The Fairlane belonged to Henry and Clara Ford. It was built by Pullman Standard in 1920. At the Rouge Works, several men are boarding number 80 for a journey down the track pulling the Fairlane. Number 80 and the Fairlane prepared to depart from the Rouge. When Ford was testing a new automobile, the Fairlane often went along on the railroad carrying Henry Ford Automotive Engineering Group. The train stopped to get automotive reports at various stations. As the number 80 and the Fairlane depart the Rouge, we find none other than Henry Ford himself at the throttle. He was a throttle artist and oftentimes ran the trains when he was making inspection trips on the DT&I. He was years ahead of his time in the implementation of the railroad as part of the automotive manufacturing assembly line. Former employees also report having seen Henry Ford pumping a hand car periodically, especially in the Jeffersonville and Kingman branch. Harvey Firestone was a frequent companion. A close-up shows the Fairlane as it's being shoved backwards by the camera. Next to the Fairlane is a standard wooden DT&I coach. The locomotive shoving the train is number 80 of the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railroad. Ford's business train makes one last run in front of the photographer's movie camera, with Ford at the throttle. On the observation platform of the Fairlane, we find Edsel and Eleanor Ford, Henry and Clara Ford, and Thomas and Mina Edison, as their train fades away from the photographer. Stay tuned for amusing bonus footage from the Ford files and the LIMA Locomotive Works. A look at the LIMA Locomotive Works in 1922. The Locomotive Works sat along South Main Street at South Lima, where the B&O, the Erie, and the Nickel Plate all crossed. Looking south from the erecting shop and panning towards the west, the roofs of several of the manufacturing departments in the Locomotive Works are plainly visible. Panning towards the west, the powerhouse and the Nickel Plate South Lima yards and shops come into view. In the distance is the Lima refinery, originally established in 1887. As the photographer turns nearly 180 degrees, we come upon the shop buildings and the Nickel Plate roundhouse. This was a heavy shop facility immediately on the other side of the gates and fence from the Lima Locomotive Works. Moving to the erecting shop roof, the twin towers of the riveting room of the boiler shop are plainly visible. The complex covered 67 acres and had just undergone a major expansion. Looking to the southwest, the Lima Locomotive Powerhouse is visible on the left, and the Nickel Plate South Lima yards sit plainly visible on the right. This is the heavy metalworking industry of the railroads. Plant Shay Locomotive Number 4 moves light through the various buildings as it prepares for its next assignment. The Shay locomotive was developed and built at Lima Locomotive Works. This is a 3-cylinder 2-truck Shay. They were built in a separate building to the north end of the complex. There were 2 other Shays assigned to movement throughout the complex, plus 2 to 3 other mechanical diesel units built on the principle of side drive Shay mechanism. Number 4 has coupled onto Nickel Plate Road, number 660, a 282, for some front-end testing. Note the white piping along the front of the locomotive in the open smoke box door. The mechanical engineers were on hand to supervise the various aspects of the testing. The Nickel Plate and the Locomotive Works oftentimes work together on joint projects to each other's mutual benefit. It cost a railroad a lot to take a locomotive out of service for a few days of testing. This injector is used to squirt water into the boiler under pressure, and behind it, the horizontal cylinder, is a booster engine. The booster engine is attached to the axle of the rear truck under the locomotive cab to give it additional starting power. In the manufacturing area, we see a sheet being rolled into the smoke box for a boiler at the rolling machine. Next to it, a boiler course is being rolled. All boilers started out as flat plate and were rolled into a cylinder shape before being riveted together. Further back in the plant, arc welding on a boiler is being undertaken. Boiler components weren't always a perfect fit the first time, so the plates were often heated and allowed to expand, thus providing the ample room necessary to connect the parts together. A completed boiler sits in the boiler shop, awaiting final hydrostatic and steam testing. The boiler shop was one of the more dangerous departments to work in at the Locomotive Works. Large steel components, parts of the boilers, were constantly moving overhead or being moved on the floor. Anybody with their hands in the wrong place at the wrong time was subject to losing fingers or maybe having a hand crushed. The loss of hearing was almost expected due to the noise if you worked in this department. On the floor of one of the machine shop departments, we find rod and frame components as they're undergoing machining. In the foundry, another iron component has just been poured. Frame machining took particularly big machine tools in order to handle the stacks of slab frames for vertical planing so that all the mating surfaces matched and aligned for repeatable fit. Many of these machine tools were made in Hamilton and Cincinnati, Ohio, at many of the big-name tool manufacturers of the day. Leading among them was Niles. Several of these heavy machine tools were still in use at the time manufacturing of locomotives ended in May of 1949. Frame machining required a high degree of accuracy so the parts would fit further out along the drivers and the drive rods. Repeatability for replacement of parts was very important. In the far left of the screen is one of the horizontal planing machines used for planing the sides of the frames. Panning across the department, the vertical slotters are busily engaged, cutting guides and other areas on the frames. These machines were very large shapers that pushed a hardened steel knife through the edges of the metal to trim any excess. A frame is suspended from an overhead hoist as one of the laborers goes about cleaning shavings and any residue left from the milling operation. Gang drilling of steel plate was necessary to accommodate all of the riveting that would later be necessary in the assembly of both the boiler and the tender. Cylinder machining was also vitally important to the successful construction of one of the LIMA locomotives. In this department, all of the machine surfaces, including the piston and the slide valve areas, were machined to a true surface. The locomotive cylinders were used to convert the power of the steam into useful work. Their accurate machining and assembly had much to do with the satisfactory performance of the LIMA locomotives. The cylinder shop took a great deal of pride in the accuracy of the machine castings. They were cast steel, poured at the Ohio Steel just across the street from the plant. Drive rods are set up on assembly jigs to ensure their complete interchangeability on the same group of locomotives. This was the home of superpower, where LIMA locomotives were born. The erecting shop held 30 assembly bays. The boiler for an Illinois Central 282 locomotive is lowered onto the erecting shop floor. Here is where the good work throughout the entire plant showed itself in the accurate assembly of many parts prepared throughout the complex. The value of superior workmanship becomes evident as the boiler is placed on the frame and everything fits perfectly. Carefully assembled and aligned frames await the placement of boilers as assembly continues. Several locomotive cabs are also visible as they await to be assembled onto the back head of the boiler. Once the frames were aligned and bolted down, the cylinder half castings were brought in and bolted to the frames, along with the beginning of the valve gear assembly. Elsewhere on the floor, the foundation crews work on the assembly of frames. The accuracy of the machined assembly was proof of the skills elsewhere in the shop. The foundation for all locomotives rested securely on the machined frame. Quality workmanship was essential for the perfect tramming of the wheels and the reduction of lateral forces in the assembly of the various working components on the drivetrain. These were vitally important components in the assembly of the finished locomotive. The plumbing of water, oil, and compressed air lines was an important part of the locomotive assembly process. A mechanic is doing some plumbing to the boiler, as another man works with a gauge to measure the front of the smoke box. The boiler insulation, jacketing, and air pumps are applied to the locomotive boiler as it begins to take on its final appearance. This locomotive is being picked up and moved to an adjacent bay for another aspect of the assembly process. The lead trucks and another boiler are staged near the assembly area, awaiting their call to begin the assembly of another LIMA-built locomotive. Superheater units are prepared for installation through the front smoke box of the awaiting locomotive boilers. With the assembly complete, a tender was joined to the locomotive and they were moved into the yard for steaming and in-plant testing. Each locomotive was run in to the satisfaction of a group of quality control experts. Over a long test track out in the yard, the locomotives were run back and forth until each part functioned satisfactory. That group of employees were locomotive inspectors, and they rode out on the engines at various places, listening for squeaks or rattles or watching for things that weren't working according to what they performance requirements. Once accepted, they were shipped. Henry Ford found this shay operating at one of the timbering camps somewhere in the Midwest. The shay locomotives, of course, were a product of LIMA Locomotive Works. Michigan lumberman Ephraim Shea conceived the idea of the geared locomotive to meet the unusual hauling conditions encountered in northwestern Michigan. He came to LIMA to have the first machine built. The Shea geared locomotive became an industry standard. By driving the wheels through gears, the Shea was able to produce an unusually high drawbar pull at starting and at low speeds. It was ideal for a haulage where track was poor, grades were steep, and the curves were severe. It marked contrast to the rod engine. The Shea-geared locomotive had from 12 to 18 power pulses to each revolution of the drivers, which resulted in a steady flow of power.
Shays hauled heavy loads of grades which rod engines and tenders of equal weight would have difficulty negotiating.
Read more about the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railroad, Henry Ford's Railroad, and Summit Hill, and the LIMA Locomotive Works with these books and DVD by Scott Trostel. Available online from canteenbooks.com.